And the doubt comes up because it's like, shouldn't this be easier? Right? Shouldn't it be easier for me to interact with people? Shouldn't it be easier? Because at one point in our lives, it was easier when we were kids. Hi there, and welcome back to Ask Dr. Syra, the show where I answer your questions about mental health, personal growth, and relationships. So today's question comes from Shira. It's a simple question, but it has a lot of complexity in the answer. So the question is, why do I have so much self-doubt? Why do I have so much self-doubt? Okay, Shira, you're not here with me. Otherwise, I would ask you like a whole bunch of questions and try to understand what the self-doubt is about, if there's certain areas that you doubt yourself in more than others, and we'd go on and on. But since you're not here, and it's just a question that could really apply to anybody, I'll give you my thoughts. And I have three kind of different areas that we can look at when we're trying to figure out why. Why do we have this self-doubt? So the first piece is around how does self-doubt start? So we'll talk about that. The second piece is about what's happening in our environment. And then the final thing is about what's happening internally. So how did it happen? What's happening around us? What's happening within us? So let's start with the how did it happen? So you might already know this, but if you don't, a little quick neuroscience 101 for you. When our brains become about 10 years old, there's a shift that happens in our brains. And so in the earlier parts of childhood, where most children, unless they're in an environment that's like where they're constantly being put down, most children until about age 5 or so, 4 or 5, feel pretty good about themselves. They feel pretty like they're not afraid to try things. They're not worried if they fail. If you think of a baby learning how to walk, right? If they had self-doubt, they wouldn't ever learn how to walk. They got to just try it and take a risk. As we get older and we start kind of listening to our environment, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, that starts to change and we start to absorb the messages from around us about our capacity, right? Because what is self-doubt? Self-doubt is, I don't think I can do it. To keep it really simple, I don't think I can do it, or I don't think I can be that for you, or I don't think I can achieve that, or I don't think that's me. I'm doubting myself, right? And it's not necessarily just doubting that you can do something. It can even be, I'm doubting who I am as a person. Am I good enough? And those questions come later. They don't come in our early years. But by about 10 years old, we've kind of been able to observe what's happening around us. And at 10, we start to be able to develop really clear perceptions of right and wrong. We can also start holding complexity in a way that we couldn't before. As we grow into our teenage years, what becomes possible for our brain is to create an ideal version of something. So up until about 10, 12, you look at your parents, you're like, yeah, they're my parents. But as you're entering into those preteen and teen years, you start thinking, but they're not like other people's parents. They're not like my friends' parents, and they're not like those parents that I'm watching on Netflix. And they're not so. And children don't do this consciously. It's just something that happens in the brain where we start being able to picture the ideal or picture the perfect version of, right? And while we do that with our parents, we do that with our teachers, we do that with our friends, and we mostly do it with ourselves. We see this ideal version of who we could be. And the teenagers can be so frustrating because for the first time, I'm figuring out that I could be great in whatever context, but I might not have the tools, the resources, the know-how to be great. So it can be super frustrating because I can imagine myself great, but I can't figure out how to get there. And that's where self-doubt really starts to take seed in us as people, is during those teenage years, because we're failing ourselves. Forget about failing anybody else. Whereas up until the teenage years, we try something, we do it, we don't do it. You know, it's not really as impactful. The other reason self-doubt starts in the teenage years is because we become acutely aware of other people watching us, right? So in the teenage years is where the brain develops the capacity to put the self in another's perspective. We're slowly starting to do that as children, but we're not very good at it. So the teenage years where we're able to like step outside of ourselves and think, what does she see when she sees me? What do they see when they see me? We can't do that before then. So we assume that what they see is not the best version of ourselves. And so then we start doubting ourselves. And if you think back to, if you know any teenagers, or if you can remember back to when you were a teenager, there's this I'm not good enough feeling that comes for a lot of, and it's a normal thing. It's a natural thing, right? And it allows us, see, because the other thing that comes with the teenagers is an impulse to take risks. And so the self-doubt helps temper that impulse to take risks. Otherwise, we would just never stop or worry or think. We would just do everything. So we need a little bit of that to say, are you sure that's a good idea? Are you sure you can do that? Are you sure you're capable of that? So it's evolutionarily important. But what happens for many of us is that we internalize it so deeply and we hold on to it in our adulthood, right? We pull that self-doubt forward. And that's where the mistake happens. Our minds are used to thinking about ourselves in a certain way, and we just keep thinking about ourselves that way. So that's how it starts, is in the early years, from 10 into the teenage years. And it's a normal thing for us to doubt ourselves, and we don't have to stop there and live there for the rest of our lives. We can actually overcome the self-doubt. So how do we overcome the self-doubt? Well, this has to do with the next two things. One is our environment, and one is what's happening internally. So if you look at your environment as an adult, does your environment support you? If you look at the culture that you live in, the community that you live in, the family that you're surrounded by, the friends that you've chosen, are those people who make you feel good about yourself generally, or are they people who make you doubt yourself generally, right? I know that there's certain communities, right? Whether they be cultural communities, faith communities, neighborhood communities, where there's this standard or this expectation of how people should be. And if they're not there, there's some judgment that comes along. There might be shame. There might be, ostracization. All of these things can happen if you don't kind of fit what the community wants for you. And so that can create a lot of self-doubt. If I want something, but my family, my community, my, everybody around me doesn't want those things, or doesn't think those things are valuable, or actually is trying to avoid those things, well, then I'm going to doubt myself, right? Because remember, we're social mammals. And so part of what we do is we try to adapt to our group, our social group. There's some social groups you're kind of stuck with, but there's other social groups that you can form. And so if you're finding that the people around you, the environment, the kind of social environment around you is increasing your self-doubt and kind of making it harder for you to trust yourself, then maybe it's time to start creating a different kind of a social group, and kind of start, making some different choices about who you want to hang out with, aside from those people that you don't have a choice. Some people, they're just stuck with them. But there's other people who you can choose to spend more time with them, less time with them. You can choose what you share with them. You can even do that with the people you're stuck with, right? You can decide how much of myself am I going to share, and how much detail am I going to go about this. So that's the second thing, is that what's the environment. The third thing is what's happening internally. So I want to teach you an idea, which I might have talked about in another video. It's called the locus of control. Okay. So in psychology, we say there's two things that can control us, right? So there's an internal locus of control where I am controlling me, right? Whatever's happening internally, that's what's controlling me. And then there's the external locus of control. So things outside of me are controlling me, are determining my choices. We learn as we grow to really value that external locus of control. Again, because we're social mammals, we have to figure out how to fit in the group. But at some point, once we're kind of steady in who we are, we need to be able to shift that and go back to an internal locus of control, where what's happening inside of me determines my actions. What's happening inside of me determines how I, show up in the world, and the choices I make, and all of that. Now, that's not to say that you can just forget about your environment, because there's some realities that we live with, right? That we can't just think our way out of, or meditate our way out of. I get that. But if you talk to the people who are really centered, really grounded, they'll talk about how their main task is to stay internally aligned, so that the things going on out here don't disrupt my inner peace. Okay? There are times when it's appropriate for me to get angry. There's times it's appropriate for me to speak up for myself or speak up for someone else. Absolutely. But there's ways of doing that where you don't get thrown off into a tizzy, right? Where you're grounded, you're present, and yeah, maybe you're angry, or maybe you're like fighting for something that's really important to you, but you're not lost in it. You haven't lost yourself, right? And I think what happens for many of us is that we don't know how to do that. All still learning how to do that. And the doubt comes up because it's like, shouldn't this be easier? Right? Shouldn't it be easier for me to interact with people? Shouldn't it be easier? Because at one point in our lives, it was easier when we were kids, because we didn't think about a lot of stuff. And a lot of stuff just like didn't impact us. We didn't notice it, right? But as we grew, we became more and more observant. And so the third thing, as I said, is coming back to that internal locus of control. What's inside of me determines my actions and what I do in the world, rather than letting everything on the outside determine my actions and what I do. It's such a powerful stance. It's confusing if you've never tried it, so you have to kind of practice it a little bit, but it's the killer for self-doubt, because you actually learn to trust yourself. You learn to say, my intuition, my knowing, my gut feelings actually trump everything. It's a very different way to live. So those are my thoughts about why we have so much self-doubt sometimes. So, where did the self-doubt come from? It's a natural and normal thing. What's happening around us in our culture, our community, our friend groups? And finally, are we able to have that internal locus of control? So those are my thoughts for you today. Keep coming back to Ask Dr. Saira. Check out the playlist. There's lots happening. The video, the YouTube channel, there's lots happening. And I think if you like or subscribe, you get like notifications or something. I don't know. Like or subscribe if you like it. If you like it, give me a thumbs up. And if you don't, that's okay. Write in the comments why you don't like it. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye.